All right. Well, thank you all for joining in. Hi, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our workshop on situated discourse analysis. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a huge shout out to Dr. Brielle Stark because of her recent achievement. She received the Tavistock Trust Award. And so if you wouldn't mind congratulating her, that would be awesome. All right. Well, thank you again for this workshop, Dr. Julie Hengst. We're all very excited. If you have missed the first part of the workshop, the video is uploaded on our website, and so you can watch it. And also the materials for today, as well as from part 1, are also available on our website. So just a reminder, if you need a letter of attendance for today, please email Dr. Brielle Stark at bcstark@iu.edu. And finally, there are question and answer segments in between. And so if you have questions that come up, please feel free to unmute and ask them, or you can drop them in the chat and I can read those out. All right, well, thank you so much. And we can get started, Dr. Hengst, whenever you're ready.
All right. All right. Thank you, Bree and Manasuita, for hosting this 2-part workshop. And welcome to part 2. We're going to begin today with a brief recap of SDA, situated discourse analysis, and then take a few minutes to share reflections on the observation activity I left you with last time. So if you have your notes, go ahead and pull them out so you're ready. Then we'll turn our attention for the rest of the session to mobilizing SDA in clinical practice. So I noted last time that discourse is a tricky term. It can be characterized as coming from one of 2 broad traditions, what Herbert Clark called product traditions, and which define discourse as a thing, and action traditions, which define discourse as processes. Product approaches to discourse focus on the language forms and on their own or in relation to specifically defined contexts, and view language essentially as a closed system. In contrast, SDA is anchored in process approaches to discourse, drawing on theories of communication, not language, and process approaches that unify texts with contexts in the temporal flows of embodied interaction, highlighting social cultural activities and cultural practices, and recognizing communication is always involving a mix of semiotic configurations. Both verbal and nonverbal resources are inextricably bound with one another. I showed this ambiguous figure last time because I think it captures the conceptual challenge we face when we do discourse work. When you first encounter this image, you see either the faces or the vase, and it then takes work to reattune your attention to see the other one. So given that CSD has really been dominated by more product traditions, it takes focused work to shift our attention, our conceptual frame to this process vision. In the last session, I defined SDA in these terms. So discourse is conceptualized dynamic communicative processes. Situated highlights that communicative processes always emerge in materially, spatially, and temporally constituted situations that not only are in the present, but link past, present, and projected futures. Analysis then highlights that it's a common task for both researchers and participants alike to develop a sense of what's going on in the interaction and test that sense out. I also then introduced this 3-part framework that widens our lens and provides a systematic way of observing or describing the whole rather than the parts of interaction. The framework centers on social cultural activities, in other words, what people are working to accomplish, participation, how people are aligning with one another and around specific activities, and communicative resources. The multi-channel sign configurations, which Asif Agha describes as an array of signs that are being performed and construed by interactants, of which language is but a fragment. I also shared this handout, which is an adaptation from a chart from my book. It lays out guiding questions framed around these 3 dimensions of SDA. They're listed here along the side of the chart. And it then applies these dimensions to the central issues of describing the dynamic complexities of interactions, identifying success, and tracing learning or change. For my ethnographic study of individuals with aphasia, I also shared a data excerpt from a community observation of Steve. Steve, if you recall, was a 33-year-old man who was 4.5 years past a massive left hemisphere CVA. Steve had been working prior to this as a physician, and this observation took place after his stroke, when he and his wife were at a hometown football game, and that for a team that Steve continued to volunteer with. So this analysis highlighted how the identity work of everyday interactions is deeply related to both the built social material spaces of the football field and the ways Steve and others were positioning themselves in and around that space, as well as to the communicative resources, such as him using a sports fan register or medical talk that indexed Steve's potential identities. And the other thing we did was I noted how tracing people as they shift among footings, indexical grounds, and activities led us to what we're calling interactional discourse resources. So IDRs are communicative resources central to managing these shifts. They're recognizable, robust, and pervasive, so they can be readily operationalized for our analyses. We looked particularly at examples of 4 of these: collaborative referencing, playful episodes, reported speech, and conversational narratives. So this is a table that I didn't actually share last time, but it comes from research on brokering that we did look at. So you remember that picture of Jesse shopping with his PA, looking for a remote control device. Well, as part of that research, we coded all observations for 5 IDRs: playful episodes, narratives, conversational repetition, procedural discourse, and trouble sources. All the participants then were co-active in these, either in co-producing or as ratified listeners or overhearers. So they were part of these IDRs. So these density maps then display that coding, the coding we did for 2 of the participants across about 30 minutes of their interaction. The bottom row describes the general activity. The next row labels columns by transcript pages. We simply counted the number of codes identified on each page, and then listed them by letters above each page number. So the density map on the bottom shows the 30 minutes of stretch from Jesse's talk. Jesse's the one we saw shopping, right? And I'm sharing it now just to underscore how pervasive these IDRs are in stretches of interaction across a day, how densely people are working to adjust their footings, and to shift and manage these indexical grounds and activities. So what are the benefits using SDA for communication disorders? Well, fundamentally, communicative interactions are at the heart of all aspects of CSD. Communicative interactions are what we aim to assess, what we aim to impact through our therapy, and how we conduct both assessment and therapy. And SDA then focuses on communicative interactions as its core object of study. It draws on well-established methods and theories to examine how people navigate everyday communicative interactions in real time, and how those interactions shape both the people and the social worlds they inhabit. For research, assessment, and intervention, SDA offers novel design principles that can be mobilized to offer innovative ways of doing our work. We talked about some of that innovative research in the first session, and today we'll be turning to translate those findings for assessment and therapy. But first, let's just take a minute to see how the observation activity went for people. So Manaswiti, if you get any questions or comments, I'll let you monitor that for us. But as you're thinking through the activity you did, I'd like to hear about what your data was that you selected for the project and how it went. Were you able to use those 3 questions to describe the big picture of what was going on? And did you see any examples of IDRs? Any thoughts on this?
Hey, Julie, this is Bree. I can give some insight while, I see Jamie's typing too.
Okay.
I was looking at, this is going to give away what my interest is, but I was looking at a rowing coaching and related type of clinic, because that's the sport I do. And I was kind of having an issue with coding, lots of overlapping and interacting narratives that were going on. There was like some young people who were chatting amongst themselves and kind of having their own private conversations. And then there was like a clinic leader who was kind of trying to direct things. And I was encountering some difficulty figuring out kind of where to focus in on and kind of what to include when I was analyzing.
Excellent.
That's something that I encountered.
So you didn't, I mean, how did you go about trying to transcribe it? Or did you just try to observe it first?
I just tried to observe it first to just make some decisions around what I wanted to actually transcribe. And I actually ended up just, for my purposes, ignoring some of the private speech, which maybe was not the best idea for an inclusive look at what was going on. Yeah, I was encountering just some questions for someone like me who doesn't usually look at conversation as often, of like the best way to really capture some of the overlapping stuff.
Yeah, I think that is both, I think, one of the great opportunities and challenges of doing work on everyday communication is that it's immensely complex and there's a lot going on. As I heard you describing it to me, I already heard you starting to use sort of these three kind of questions. You started by saying where you were, what was going on, that there were a lot of people involved in a lot of sort of, if you will, subgroups around that space. And then you started talking about who was participating with whom. It would be a way to do it, would be to hone in. I'll say who's interacting with whom. And then you mentioned narrative, which of course has been just a powerful interest of mine because I think it's so pervasive in what we do. And a lot of our researchers on discourse focus on narrative. And part of what you can look at is the patterns of co-production, tellability, how they merge in and out of. And that's where I really liked looking at Oakes and Capps dimensions of narrative production, because they really are designed to look at how it emerges in and gets in particular interactions, how it folds into or is embedded in or stands out from the conversation that it surrounds it. So yeah.
It looks like Jamie has a comment here saying, I looked at a virtual book club session and I saw all 3 IDRs.
Oh, good. Can you give us an example, Jamie?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've looked at this data before, but I wanted to look at it again from a different lens. And so let's see, the verbal play was really interesting because they were reading a book and the main character was drank a little bit too much. And so they had a lot of fun kind of laughing and talking about how much he drank and how crazy he was. And so that was kind of fun to see. But one of the interesting shifts I saw in kind of my interpretation, I guess, of what was going on with the facilitator was, I mean, she was a little heavy-handed, and it was a virtual group, and that tends to happen. But I noticed that she directed so much of the turns in the beginning of the session, but as she moved away from the book and kind of shifted to people with aphasia in their lives, she really used questions very strategically to kind of make that conversational narrative happen. And so she kind of opened the floor and asked these great questions. And then she shifted to the listener at that point. And then they became more of the tellers of any kind of story that happened. And so I don't think I interpreted that happening, but not in that way in thinking about these IDRs. So that was kind of fun to see.
Yeah. So what you're seeing is sort of people, even in the middle of the narrative telling, shifting from being an audience to a co-teller to sort of a passive listener to an active listener. Yeah, these changes can happen on a moment by moment basis. Fascinating. Did you get a good story out of it in the end?
Yeah, I think so. It was just, like I said, interesting to see it from a different lens when thinking about the IDRs, and not, I think sometimes I have a tendency to have too big of a focus on what the facilitator does. And, this helped me really see that co-construction and that minute by minute change in identity and roles that,
Mhm.
and it was pervasive through the whole thing. So it was fun.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing is what I think is a really nice way to begin to blend, if you will, these different approaches in sort of a mixed method or triangulated analysis. If we start with that complex pattern of how it's unfolding, the processes of it, we can always do, zoom in and do some analysis of the particular structures they seem to be having command over, right? Which is, of course, a good clinical question for us. We just don't know what to do with those behaviors until we understand how they are impacting the flow of interaction. So going back and forth between those two, I think, is a direction that's really potentially very valuable. Nice. Very nice. Other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, there are two. So Sarah Grace writes, I looked at a video of an informal aphasia conversation group as well. There were lots of examples of verbal play and conversational narratives.
Good. Excellent. And again, were you able to see some of the sort of evolving shift in the process of how people engaged around those narratives?
Yeah, so similar to kind of what Jamie was reporting, that the facilitator started out constructing a lot more of, or kind of shaping the form of the conversation. It was really interesting to notice that as the group went on in time, one of the individuals with aphasia really took over that role of facilitation.
Wow.
Was asking his conversational partners questions, getting that, like bringing them into the conversation, which was really fun to see, especially because he also had, I think, the most like motor speech impairment. So he was probably the most difficult to understand, but also was actively facilitating and trying to bring the conversation together.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I think when we get toward the end of the hour and we start talking about what are the markers of rich communicative environments, that's a really nice one to bring back in. So I'll pin that for you, Sarah.
Perfect.
And the other one?
Great. So Gloria says, I looked at an open conversation aphasia group session. It displayed a range personal narratives of conversationalists with aphasia and the student clinician participants. Stories were both short and long, and they paralleled each other in structure and content along running themes.
Oh, that's really interesting. That's something we haven't quite talked about, and I'm not going to touch on much today, but the notion that we get these sort of the pattern of the day kind of thing. So when we're story swapping or doing extended stories, it's not unusual for the story that I'm telling to become a bit of a model for the next story in conversation, and for the next story, as we all kind of tell the same kind of story with different bents and from our own perspective. So what a really nice example that is. Again, not something we're talking about much today, but I think it's one of the huge benefits of thinking from this rich environment standpoint. So very nice. So I'll pin that one too, Gloria, and you have to bring that one back.
And Jamie has a follow-up comment.
Okay.
I also looked at Aphasia Bank Club session,
Yes.
saw some great verbal play from less verbal participants.
That's fascinating, isn't it? We tend to, when I was first presenting some of this work like 20 years ago, I had some discourse analysts in the audience who would say, but how can you look at that when they don't have enough language? And it's like, how can you not look at it? Because it's these patterns of play and verbal play and in nonverbal play that language has to fit into and support in everyday interaction. So I think we have to start with a bigger picture. We don't start with language when we learn language, we start with social interaction. And so the same thing's going on here. That's really nice. Nice observation.
I also just wanted to clarify, I apologize. This comment was from Jamie Lee.
Oh, hey, Jamie.
Jamie.
Excellent. I'm glad you spoke up, Jamie Lee. All the more reason why some of these more ethnographic approaches that let us really dig into the particulars of interaction and not look just for the sort of the normative patterns, the central patterns, but the particulars become really powerful resources for us. So nice job. Okay, there's several that are pinned that I expect you to come back to now when we get to the end. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Yeah, actually, Suma has also written, so I'm going to read that out.
Okay.
I am one of the team members who coded Jesse's data, and I'm very familiar with IDRs. Throughout that process, I know how much speakers tended to repeat words and gestures within narratives. However, I looked at IDRs within graduate student clinician-led aphasia groups. I observed repetition to be a theme, even within this type of talk. I'm thinking that repetitions during conversations and narratives are powerful and therapeutic.
Yes, I agree. Obviously, Suma, I'm on board with you on that one. I think the challenge for us is how do we get the kind of data, and I'll present some of it here today, that supports that. Because I think theoretically, there's every reason to think conversational repetition is just as powerful or more powerful than the kind of repetition we get in drill. So absolutely. So I'll present some data on that, and we can, brainstorm about how we do those kinds of analysis down the road. Excellent. All right, let's go ahead and move on then. Oops, just a second. To using SDA to redesign assessments. And thanks everybody for talking. I really appreciate those insights that'll help us as we go forward here. So we began our work of translating SDA to clinical practice by designing a discourse elicitation protocol that would preserve the interactional features of different types of discourse. So understanding discourse as a product, the traditional approach to eliciting protocols calls for the clinician to provide standard prompts, verbally or non-verbally, to target the discourse types like narrative. The clinician is focused on not assisting the client in order to collect uncontaminated discourse samples. So a clinician gives a prompt, tell me a story, and then becomes a relatively silent observer, providing additional prompts as needed, like tell me more. Assessment focuses on the client's verbal productions, the amount, type, talk of linguistic forms produced. In contrast, when we shift to understanding discourse as fundamentally interactional, distributed, and collaborative, and recognize that people's patterns of participation differ across different types of discourse, we then need to design a protocol that's aimed to preserve these interactional features of the different discourse types. So informed by research on IDRs, the protocol we designed assumed that the clinician's role is to collaborate with the client in producing discourse types. For example, in narrative discourse, the clinician should align as an engaged audience to the client's narrative telling. So a clinician will conversationally present a discourse prompt, will shift their stance to support the client's successful co-production of whatever the discourse type is, and then conversationally transition across these prompts. Assessment will focus on the collaborative production of the discourse, that is, on all contributions of all participants, looking at the full array of communicative resources. For the pilot then, we called this the mediated discourse elicitation protocol, but I won't go into a long explanation of that. We nicknamed it the MEDUP. The clinician was Melissa Duff, and the client was Susan. Susan had dense chronic amnesia. We designed the protocol to elicit 4 types of discourse: conversation, narrative, picture description, and procedural. And the protocol put the conversational sample first, always, to get a back and forth, more egalitarian tone set for the session. And then the clinician was asked to conversationally transition across the different types and to actively collaborate with the client on producing those discourse targets. So in the first session, when we tried this, Melissa found it difficult to break out of her clinical training. After analyzing that session, we further elaborated the protocol, and she did it again with Susan, who, remember, had no memory of the earlier session because she had dense amnesia. Melissa was able to effectively alter the ways she collaborated with Susan for these different types of discourse. So comparing these 2 protocols, we found that when Melissa actively engaged as a communication partner in the targeted discourse type, she elicited more and more ecologically valid discourse, including longer, more complex utterances across the session, discourse more aligned with everyday interactions, and samples that supported our analysis of both linguistic forms and interactional dimensions of these discourse types. So to give you a sense of how these 2 sessions differed, here are transcripts of discourse elicited from the frightening story prompt. This text is too small really to read here, but it just gives you a sense of how much more talk occurred when the clinician's stance changes from being a reserved observer to an active audience. The red here represents Melissa's talk in the transcript, and the blue is text that was coded not as narrative. Here's a table that compares different types of analyses of those narratives. It illustrates how striking the differences were. I should note that when I mention turns here, that these are interactional turns. They're not defined by T or C units. So quantitatively, we can see that there were more turns, 22 versus 13, and that both Susan and Melissa spoke more. And there were more words, 332 versus 252, with most of this difference being in Susan's talk. Qualitatively, the differences were more striking. In the first session, Susan told 2 brief narratives, one was 4 turns and the other was 1 turn, that were quite limited in tellership, tellability, and linearity. However, in contrast with the communication partner, Susan told a 22-turn story of a beauty parlor robbery. Melissa acted as an engaged audience. Tellability, tellership, and linearity were all very strong. When we understand discourse as collaborative, as a duet, then the traditional stance is not neutral. The rationale we usually have for doing those kind of directed elicitation tasks. But instead, we have to understand it as suppressive, a competency-reducing practice. So overall from this, we concluded that complex interactional discourse can be elicited between clinicians and clients in clinical settings, that research on IDRs can guide clinicians on how to collaborate with clients around different discourse types, and that clinicians can quickly learn to shift interactional roles and stances in order to successfully collaborate with clients. The pilot of the MedDep also highlighted for us the importance of being reflective practitioners. We noted at the time in that article, when discussing these findings with others, we are often met with the response that some clinicians are simply better communicators than others. The implication seems to be that effective communication in clinical settings is a mystery, perhaps a natural gift for some, but in any case, beyond serious analysis or instruction. For a field constituted on the premise of clinical intervention to improve linguistic and communicative abilities, we found that view to be decidedly odd. So it's important to note that Melissa had developed a deep understanding of what amnesia was, had extensive experience as a clinician, as well as working as a research assistant in the Amnesia Research Lab, had actually worked with Susan repeatedly and well, had actively participated in designing the MedDep, and was actually quite excited to be trying it out. Even with all these really ideal conditions, the first pilot was not a success. It took reflective practice. We reviewed video of the session, discussed how well-honed clinical practices and stances had overridden the protocol, and then significantly revised the protocol, arriving at the more detailed version that is in your handout that I just showed. SDA provides tools to analyze, reflect on, and hone our clinical discourse practices. That is, how clinicians, as well as all participants, are co-producing the discourse samples we analyze. Okay, any questions on the MedDep before we go on? I'm not seeing this chat.
There are no questions, but I just wanted to share a little comment on this, Dr. Hengst. So I observed a session between a clinician and a person with aphasia, and it just, as we're talking about situated discourse analysis, it just occurred to me something as basic as the video was cutting off. It was focused on the person with aphasia, and it was cutting off, the clinician and what gestures they were using. And I just felt like, well, you can just, as basic as that, maybe in the future, we do need to have all the conversational partners in the video, so it actually looks like it's a conversation, because there are so many nonverbal, things that we need to think about, and they contribute to a much richer conversation. So.
Manasuda, that is an excellent observation. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've spent, 20 years researching and doing this. And I would like clinicians from this point out to not have to spend 20 years doing that. And there are small things we can do right away to widen our scope. You are absolutely right expanding the video of what we're taking pictures of is one way. And I know one of the things that we've done in my lab for the research, and Suma and Martha can attest to this, is we use multiple cameras, because I think there's some value in focusing in on the client or on, you know, the participant that we wanted to understand more. But we can't interpret that without understanding the whole interaction. So we actually do multiple cameras. But in clinical settings, clearly having a camera focus where you can see what everybody's doing would be a really important first step. Really nice observation. Good. Other thoughts? All right, let's then move on to looking at rich communicative environments. So as I considered implications of my research for clinical translation, I increasingly returned to the generative work of some pioneers in experience-centered neuroplasticity. So as a behavioral neuroscientist, Donald Hebb's early observations comparing his pet rats to his lab rats inspired the study of environmental enrichment. It led researchers to examine mechanisms by which environment and experience can influence brain structure and function, and his ideas formed the basis for extensive research on how enriched environments stimulate behavior and physical development. As a neuropsychologist and a co-founder of culture historic activity theory, Alexander Luria defined higher mental functions as organized around motivated activities, not isolated behaviors, and as distributed in functional systems, both embodied and social. His theories also highlighted functional plasticity, that is, the ways that higher mental functions and functional brain systems develop and change due to external and internal conditions. So taken together, these lines of research call on us to theorize and systematically study the relationship between communicative environments and functional plasticity. Given that much of that work on environmental enrichment and experience-dependent neuroplasticity has focused on animal models, it was critical to review that literature with an eye to translating it for CSD. So a key article in that translation is this review that Melissa Duff, Teresa Jones, who's a neuroscientist working with animal models, and I wrote in 2019. In animal models, environmental enrichment might be described this way. Animals housed in environmentally complex conditions, living together in large social groups in a cage filled with toys and other objects that individuals can traverse and manipulate, conditions that simultaneously stimulate greater social, cognitive, perceptual, and physical activity. Summarizing long lines of research on environmental enrichment, Jones offered this observation in our review. There is no treatment approach that has been more well replicated to improve function in rodent models of acquired brain injury than housing in a complex environment. So translating that work we wanted to broadly define communicative environments as the physical, social, and temporal dimensions of all communicative interactions. Drawing on SDA theories and research, we argue that rich communicative environments can be characterized by three dimensions: complexity, voluntariness, and optimization. Each of these dimensions are described along a continuum from rich to restrictive. It's important to note that these are ways of characterizing, not judging, environments. However, theoretically, we have strong reasons to seek rich communicative environments to support situated learning. So at the given that my research has focused on understanding how people successfully navigate the complexities of everyday communicative interaction, I have mostly studied interactions in environments that would fall on the richer side of this continuum. That is, participants interacting with people of their own choosing during their everyday activities and spaces. Such environments are complex and are likely to involve multiple participants engaged in multiple activities, actively using diverse multimodal resources and taking up and shifting among communicative roles and building on their own histories, experiences, and expertise. Environments that support voluntariness are likely to provide opportunities for people to make choices about how and when they participate and to invite and support multiple means and ways of participating. And environments that optimize participants' experiences are likely to be marked by a balance of novel and familiar routines, a sense of flow, an immersive quality, and positive affective engagement. They are usually evaluated as successful or not in terms of the intrinsic metrics of the activity. What are they doing? What are they getting done? And they're conducive to fluid redistribution of communicative competence and expertise. The images here then from my research on Cindy Magic, from a striking musical performance in the street, and from everyday conversations suggest environments that might have some of these characteristics. At the other end of the continuum are restrictive environments. These are often associated with institutionalized spaces built to enforce a dominant set of activities and to compel people to align around key roles. In restrictive environments, we expect limited or non-meaningful complexity with few participants, limited activities, and prescribed or tightly controlled ways of participating. Voluntariness is limited by these minimal opportunities and also by authority figures who direct, coerce, compel specific ways of doing things. Optimization of experience is often limited for most of the people involved due to the disjointed quality of what's going on there. It's marked by limited, positive, effective engagement and may even include signs of resistance, frustration, fear, and anger. They're evaluated often by limited, rigid, or external metrics of success. And they're often highly repetitive or rote routines with limited novelty and or high demands that are not conducive to shared problem solving. The images here of highly regulated classrooms, of a speech drill, of a TSA checkpoint at an airport, and even a very formal dinner party illustrate environments that might match some of these characteristics. Environmental enrichment then highlights that communicative environments are malleable. Restricted environments can be redesigned to be richer, and rich environments can be optimized for individuals and groups. And that we can use these characteristics of rich communicative environments as design principles for clinical activities and spaces by focusing on ways of increasing the meaningful complexity, enhancing voluntary participation, and optimizing experiential quality for specific individuals by building connections between clinical sessions and clients' everyday lives. I want to stress, though, as I noted earlier, that within SDA, rich and restrictive are descriptive terms, not judgment. So rich is not good and restrictive is not bad. Instead, communicative environments can be evaluated in terms of what activities they support and what practices are being developed and learned. Again, though, our review argues that rich communicative environments are strongly associated with positive outcomes in health, learning, and healing, making rich communicative environments something we should be focusing on in our clinical work. Okay, let's look now at some of our research on designing rich communicative environments in clinical settings. So central to building rich communicative environments in clinical settings is selecting a dominant activity or set of activities and then designing interventions within and around those dominant activities. So first, we need to select dominant activities that have meaningful complexity, invite voluntary participation, and optimize experiential quality for the client. In other words, rich activities. We then need to embed clinical goals meaningfully, what we sometimes call transparently, within the dominant activity. And third, we need to stay fully accountable to the dominant activity, relying on the communicative practices, routines, and resources typical of that activity. I'll focus here just on the two examples from our research that we select about how we selected dominant activities. The first one is the collaborative referencing intervention, and the second one is animal-assisted therapy. So in the first part of the workshop, I introduced ways I drew on theories of distributed communication and functional systems to redesign Herbert Clark's barrier task, to include, which included shifting to a partial barrier, recruiting familiar participants, pairs, making the protocol more like a friendly gameplay, expanding the number of sessions, using local photos as well as tangrams, and videotaping and transcribing the full sessions, including the time between, before, between, and after referencing trials. So essentially then, from the dominant activity here is friendly gameplay among familiar partners. I had noted two of the research studies that we did using this adaptive barrier task. One was the one I conducted with participant pairs managing aphasia, and the other was a study that Melissa Duff conducted with pairs managing amnesia. And we found that there was successful collaborative referencing by all pairs in both studies. Pairs accurately identified and placed their 12 cards each trial. They got faster across trials and displayed less overt collaborative effort. And they established unique labels for each of the cards that stabilized and simplified. This is illustrated nicely in this series of initial referencing expressions that Steve used for this tangram card that he ended up calling the ice skater. We also found complex semiotic labels, like Mary's use of flapping arm gesture for this tangram card, and her son, a card that her son called just simply Starman. Or like Deborah and Monica, each time they referenced this image of a grocery store in the mall, they deliberately described different activities they did in that mall. I noted as well that all the pairs displayed robust learning, but this was especially striking in Melissa's study, where the individuals with amnesia displayed comparable rates of learning to comparison pairs, even though from session to session, they didn't remember that they'd ever played the game. Finally, I also noted that in both studies, participants engaged in creative language use during as well as before, between, and after Berry task trials, even the partners with aphasia. So combined, these findings of robust learning and complex varied language use and gestures, led us to consider redesigning the barrier task as a potential intervention. So we made the following changes. We increased the number of referencing targets, selecting those targets with the client and family to address their own goals. We expanded the number of sessions from 4 to 10. We expanded and clarified participant roles, and given that we were particularly interested in whether the research findings with familiar partners could be replicated by a clinician partner, we actually chose 2 clinicians. One was the clinician partner to stay focused on gameplay, and we added a clinician moderator role. We kept the emphasis on making the game friendly gameplay, and a key rule, of course, always for us was to have fun. We added opportunities before, between, and after to review and support agreed upon target labels. So another way to think about this is for this translation, our dominant activity was friendly gameplay, not competitive, with minimal rules that allowed them to adapt and change it. And we've sort of modeled it on other types of barrier games like Stratego, Jeopardy, and charades. We embedded treatment goals in it by using familiar referencing targets, taking individual photos for each pair, and tapping into the repeated engagement of labeling cards that was part of the gameplay. And we worked with the clinicians to be accountable to the dominant activity. Trust the game became our mantra. Clinicians supported successful gameplay, both in their roles as the game partner and as the moderator between. There was no such thing as cheating. So our initial pilot study was designed to explore the feasibility then of using the CRI with clients specifically. Would clients and their families actively collaborate with clinicians in developing the referencing targets, and could clients engage with these greater number of cards and greater number of sessions? And more importantly, could clinicians stay aligned as gameplay partners during the intervention and resist slipping into a clinical stance that would detract from gameplay? We recruited Dave, who was a 67-year-old man with mild anomia and severe memory impairment. Melissa was a clinician partner, and Lori was the clinician moderator. And I coordinated the research and worked with the family to develop these relevant playing cards, taking most of the photos myself. The pilot was successful. As a pair, Dave and Melissa's game trials closely aligned with our earlier research findings. They displayed successful gameplay, completing all 6 game trials and all 10 sessions, and accurately placing cards. Successful collaborative referencing. In addition, Dave was actively involved throughout. And finally, and most important to us, the clinicians both actively collaborated with Dave around the game. Melissa as her game partner, and Lori as a resource between trials. However, in order to trust the game, that is, to design treatment around dominant activities, we need to understand what communicative patterns are typical of the dominant activity. So to better understand those communicative practices during friendly gameplay of the CRI, we completed several situated analyses of the interactions during these initial studies. So this is the one I mentioned earlier that focused on repetition, looking at studying repeated engagement. So what we did then is we first identified what Dave and Melissa's agreed upon target label was for each of the 12 cards at the end of each session. And then we gathered this information with those post-trial interviews or conversations. We then identified all the referencing expressions for the target cards during gameplay and coded them either as matching the ATL, which is the first use of it during that card placement sequence, a repetition of the ATL, a non-ATL, something that was different than the ATL, and a repetition of some specific non-ATL. So what did we find? Dave and Melissa averaged over 202 referencing expressions per session. The game itself, if you looked at how we designed it, only promoted about 144 repetitions. And across these sessions, their use of ATLs, the agreed upon target labels, increased, and their use of non-ATLs decreased. So here's an example of how Dave and Melissa's referencing expression looked for a card that was actually a little bit difficult for them. In this session, they actually settled on 2 agreed upon target labels. They agreed to call it the intersection name, University and Neil, and or the presence of 2 cars. So in the first session, Melissa offered these first intersection name, University and Neil as a possible label, and then said it 3 more times essentially before that they placed the card. In trial 2, Melissa again offered this intersection label of University and Neil, and Dave offered 2 cars as a label. And in the next 4 sessions, these were the only labels they used, either University and Neil or the 2 cars. Okay. Happily for us, the creative interactions and use of varied IDRs found in the research setting among familiar partners also emerged in these clinical interventions, which I think is the point Suma was starting to get to. For example, we then did an analysis looking at the voices used by Melissa and Dave during those sessions. This analysis coded 3 types of dialogic voices, what we call typified social voices, reinvoicing or reported speech phenomena, and personalized voices. It's important to keep in mind that these are not mutually exclusive categories. They often overlapped and were co-occurring. So what did we find from this analysis? Dave and Melissa played all 3 types of voicings across all sessions. There were 20 different social voices reflecting their various expertise and roles. And they used reinvoicing both to support labeling cards and verbal play, just like we saw in the research studies. And that personalized voice was most evident in Dave's productions across sessions. So Dave drew on his long career in broadcast journalism, and we saw that come out in numerous ways. For example, in this first one is an example how he routinely animated jingles just for fun. So when Melissa mentioned Walmart, he then at the end started singing "Always Lower Prices." I guess I don't know the jingle well, but he sang it well. And then when discussing a World War II era radio dramas, he again noted one about the FBI, and then using his announcer voice said, "This is your FBI." On another occasion, which was really interesting to us, is when he was having trouble recalling a label, and he would have a long pause, and then to account for that, he would slip into that sort of technical difficulties announcement we used to hear on the TV and the radio. "I'm having a mental lapse, stand by," he'd say. So Suma's dissertation has continued research exploring the efficacy of the CRI. Her dissertation replicated the pilot with 4 additional participants with chronic aphasia, using 2 clinicians, partner and moderators, as the moderator and the gaming partner. She also used 30 personalized referencing expressions for each participant, and we made special individualized photos for them. And again, I want to reiterate that personalized referencing targets are not words. These are the people, locations, activities, and experience that a participant wanted to more successfully reference, often in multiple ways, during everyday interactions. She used a single case design, assessing the impact of the CRI, which was now the independent variable, on participants' confrontation naming, which was the dependent variable. This essentially flips the script on questions of generalization. So we're looking to see if participation in these complex communicative activities of the CRI would generalize to the more tightly controlled confrontation naming task. So what did she find? Participant pairs displayed the successful collaborative referencing during the game trials that is predicted. And she found a positive impact of CRI on the patient's confrontation naming tasks. Okay, the second example of enriching clinical environments from our research is Martha's exploration of animal-assisted therapy as a way to enrich interactions in a medical setting. Her she had two main questions for her goal. One was to compare the communicative environments of AAT and traditional SLP settings. And the second was to consult with SLPs so that they could learn how to target communication goals during AAT and to monitor their progress. She recruited 10 patients on a subacute floor, 2 SLPs with experience but not experienced in AAT, and 4 dog handler teams. She recorded 2 video sessions for each participant or each patient, interviewed all the patients as well as other participants, consulted with the SLPs during treatment, and then collected weekly self-report measures by the SLPs to track their changes in planning time and confidence across a 6-week timeline. So what did she find? AAT sessions offered richer communicative environments. There were more people, more talk, greater variety of talk. Patients displayed greater talk time, used longer, more complex turns, and initiated more, which is perhaps the more striking finding. There was also marked positive engagement throughout, both with the dog, like using pet register, and with one another. Interactions focused on the group's shared experiences with this dog and with their broader interests in dogs and pets. The table on the right then just compares the use of IDRs for each in each session for each participant. Blue is the AAT sessions and orange are traditional sessions. And the dotted lines indicate the average across sessions. So it shows that AAT sessions had significantly more IDRs for 9 of the 10 participants, and it was a pretty striking difference in most cases. During the weekly planning sessions, Martha responded to the SLP's questions and concerns about AAT, talked about foundational concepts of rich communicative environments, and discussed sample activities and how they might be applicable for specific patients. And again, across these 6 weeks, we saw nice improvements in the SLP's confidence, from only some confidence in week 1 to high confidence in week 4, and a decrease in their planning time from taking an hour in the first week to about 5 minutes from 4 weeks on. So our work on developing and using both the CRI and the AAT, or the animal assisted therapy, has begun to have us exploring 2 other SDA concepts that we think will be particularly helpful in designing rich communicative environments and clinical spaces. The first is affinity spaces. In general terms, affinity spaces simply refer to spaces where people come together around a shared interest, like a club. I'm drawing here on James G's discussions of affinity spaces. So just quickly, he was a linguist who was interested in understanding how struggling learners, that is people who were failing in school, were still often able to become expert video gamers. And over 15 years, he studied popular online video games, gamers, and gameplay, learning to play games himself and observing and interviewing others. His question was, how do successful computer games and gaming platforms get new players to sustain through these long and difficult games and keep experienced players engaged? His answer was well-designed video game worlds, software and gaming platforms, and the affinity spaces that emerge around their play work together to function as rich social environments for players. So he defined these affinity spaces as those social material spaces where players engage with one another and game designers outside of gameplay. People are drawn to them as a means of learning more about and engaging with others around their common interests in the game. Affinity spaces, of course, vary widely, including formal clubs, informal groups, meeting face-to-face, meeting online. But we're particularly interested in what G described as highly engaging affinity spaces. And you'll see from this box here that they align closely with what we've been talking about as the design principles of rich communicative environments. So in treatment planning, we need to be thinking about selecting both dominant activities and designing affinity spaces around clients' interests. So just as an example, the collaborative referencing intervention, we selected the CRI and designed opportunities then before, between, and after trials for Dave to talk with all of us about the referencing targets, not just by naming them, about the photo cards, like who took them, and sometimes critiquing the quality of the photos, and about word games in general, public speaking, everyday communicative successes and challenges. In contrast with the animal-assisted therapy session, we selected the interest-focused first, animals and pets, and then designed the sessions around that interest, including the dog handler team in the session and learning together as a group about the dog, focusing on authentic, interest-focused activities, such as ways of interacting with the dog and swapping pet stories, and more importantly, following the client's lead. I want to end with one more, which is interactional correlates. So much as Tannen noted that creative discourse patterns typical of literary discourse have been honed from everyday talk, the concept of interactional correlates highlights that clinical techniques and cueing strategies have also been honed from common everyday interactions. In clinical settings, specialized supports and cueing hierarchies are often skill or strategy specific and used by clinicians to direct their clients' performance and assess what supports are effective. In contrast, outside of clinic, everyday reminders and cues are often used directed at getting things done. So the challenge for us is to identify and draw on activity-specific cues that optimize a client's participation in the dominant activity and as well as supporting their communicative goals. So one we looked at or mentioned already is pet register. So that happened by everybody during the AAT sessions. It aligns with the more structured features of melodic intonation therapy. So pet register, people use short repetitive phrases with simple structures. They're produced slowly often with exaggerated intonation and with accompanying gestures. Plus, pet register is doing social interactional work. The second one I wanted to highlight is conversational repetition. This is what was happening during the collaborative referencing intervention, and again, what Suma was talking about in her comment a few minutes ago. Conversational repetition aligns with drill-based repetition, repeating target words and phrases, but it's also aligned with social interactional work. And of course, there's many, many more. We've just sort of begun looking at things this way. So in summary, we can draw an SDA for clinical goals by thinking about how distributed communication and IDRs can impact the way we assess discourse. We can elicit discourse samples in clinical settings that preserve interactional dimensions and optimize client successful productions. And we can draw on SDA research, especially everyday use of IDRs, to guide clinicians in how to collaborate with clients on those target discourses. And we can use the rich communicative environment design principles, affinity spaces, and interactional correlates to begin to bring rich environments into intervention. By designing dominant activities that align with these principles, by designing affinity spaces that are aligned with clients' interests, and by designing 4 interactional correlates to optimize clients' successful participation in dominant activities. And I will pause there for questions. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thoughts?
Thank you. I just wanted to say there's a lot of interest in AAT specifically.
Yes.
Brielle says, I definitely need to be a part of a replication of this if it means I get to use dogs in my research. How awesome. And then Sarah Grace says, 100%, my dog loves to be the center of attention.
So that would be a study of the dog itself, not the people, right? So it's interesting that you say that. I'm sure that Martha, who is continuing this line of work and is already trying to set up a study at an additional hospital down in Louisiana, would be happy to talk about it. And one of the things we've done is we've collaborated with a neuroscientist who is going to help us look particularly at the dog. And we just submitted an abstract to the Animal Behavior Society to see if we can get some discussions going there. So joking aside, yes, I think we need to look at the dog too.
That's excellent.
Other thoughts or questions?
So I think that this is so interesting, and I very much appreciate you taking the time to, for me at least, introduce me to the topic of situated discourse analysis. I was thinking about some really interesting connections with presentations I heard at Aphasia Access a couple of weeks ago. Will Hula no, not Will Hula, Will Evans, is developing these aphasia like language board games. And it seems like it has a lot of the same kind of overlapping ideas of they are designed to help with, eliciting language, but in a much more natural context. And for people who enjoy gaming and that was a major part of their identity pre-stroke or pre-brain injury, gets them back into a preferred activity that they would, they really enjoy and want to do, and also, have the benefit of these kinds of more therapeutic things as well.
Oh, absolutely. I've been really taken with gaming research and play more broadly, and thinking about how we can better bring that into our work. I think the critical thing for us is to make sure that we actually, to tap into rich communicative environments, we need to actually play games, not gamify our tasks. So there's a big difference in a lot of discussion in gaming literature about the difference between gameplay and gamification. So I think this is where our mantra of trust the game came from. If you actually are playing the game and the game has been well designed to enhance the environment, enrich the environment, and also to embed in the kinds of supports that are going to help this particular patient, then you don't have to stay focused on the patient. You play the game. You do whatever you need to do to play the game. So I think that's the slight shift between thinking about gameplay versus gamification. But there's a lot more work that we can be doing around that. I really appreciate that comment, Sarah.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. There are no more questions, just a comment from Karen Copeland. She says, thank you so much, such fun information. And I agree with that, very interesting information. Jennifer mentions tremendous implications and possibilities for family training.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. This isn't a secret. And in fact, with that, I will leave you with a list here. Speaking of family training, this is work I didn't have time to fit into the study, but it's Diane Ackerman's books. Two of hers that I have found immensely helpful. One on deep play, which came out in 2000, and the other one on 100 Names for Love, which I think probably many people here are familiar with. In 100 Names for Love, she's actually talking about how she found a disconnect between what the clinicians did with her husband after his massive stroke and what they were able to do at home when she worked to enrich the environment. So it's a very thought-provoking and beautifully written book. So.
Yes, and Jennifer also says great adjunct to coursework for students, which I agree again. Yes, that would be pretty important to read.
So do people feel like this is enough of an introduction to start trying to take some of these ideas? I mean, Manaswiti, you already mentioned just broadening your camera angle is a first step towards seeing this.
Absolutely, I agree. And I do want to say that, yes, this is a good, very nice and comprehensive introduction to the topic. And, many of us are interested in this, just again, going back to increasing the ecological validity of what we're doing, and start looking at conversation and making it more richer for people with aphasia and other neurological disorders. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, and again, I really appreciate the work of Focus Aphasia and being invited to come present, and let's keep these conversations going.
Yes, we definitely should.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there are no other questions, comments?
Not that I can see. Yeah.
All right. Well, please feel free to email me, and I look forward to more discussions in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks all.